2 years ago, we asked the question, how do we stay safe online? Since then, progress has been made. Businesses, tech leaders, governments, and wider society have taken the time to understand the how and have moved on to the do. But in digital spaces, progress rarely moves in a straight line. So, how far have we really come in making the internet a secure and empowering space for everyone? Today we answer the big question, is the internet getting safer?
The challenges that we're seeing are emerging almost as quickly than we are regulating and acting.
It's not just a dining room table, it's a boardroom or a board table issue.
If we want the lasting change that we're talking about, it really has to be a dynamic approach.
We only ever talk about the harms that slip through the net. Imagine all the harms that platforms are catching.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Ollie Carpenter and I'm joined today by my co-host Steph Dobbs. Now, a lot can happen in 2 years, especially online. The use of generative AI has become widespread. And whilst it has the potential to make us more productive and creative, it's also armed bad actors with new ways to pose serious risks to us all. So are things improving when we're online or just changing? And what role can businesses and individuals play in keeping up with new technology to create an internet that is safe and valuable for everyone? Today, we're answering the big question, is the internet getting safer?
And today, we're joined by Cosma Wiltshire, who is Lead Strategy and Public Affairs at FlipGen. Welcome, Cosma.
Thank you.
And James Smith, who is Head of Trust and Safety at Deloitte UK. Welcome.
Lovely to be here, thank you.
Thanks for being both with us. So as we mentioned in the intro, 2 years ago on this very sofa, we asked that question of how do we stay safe online. So that's obviously a very useful place for us to start again. Maybe we could just start with a quick overview in terms of what's actually been done in the last couple of years to try and improve digital safety in that period. So James, let's maybe start with you. What significant developments have we seen in that period?
Great, thank you. So I think regulation is the first thing to talk about. Obviously, in the last 2 years, that's tightened up. We've seen other things such as codes of conduct coming in on top of the Online Safety Act, which we sort of had from 2023, and the DSA slightly before that. So that's the sort of first major driving force, and that's certainly where we see a lot of our conversations going. I would say other factors, as a parent, I would say other factors involve civil society pressures, things like parental advocacy. So those things are all sort of in force now, as well as individual investigations, which highlight certain issues around trust and safety, and of course, certain high-profile cases that we will have had in the media, particularly involving child safety. So there's a number of driving factors, and it's quite a minefield to try and sort through that, I would say.
I bet. And I suppose, Cosma, then those are obviously some examples of really high-profile things that are very commonly in the press. Have there perhaps been less visible but equally just as important things happening over the last couple of years that have made a stride when it comes to digital safety?
Yeah, I think we've seen a real shift from sort of the question of if we should regulate to the question of what and how we should regulate. And I think that those are the kinds of conversations that I've definitely been involved in. I'd say behind the scenes and more kind of in the forefront of the public sphere, perhaps in the past few months, there's been a lot of youth advocacy in this space. So I work with FlipGen, which is a youth-led digital wellbeing movement. They have launched their For Us campaign, which is campaigning for collaboration to lead us towards like a safer digital space. And there's been lots of various initiatives like that. There's also been lots of international collaboration, especially amongst young people, to make sure that the issues that we are targeting within regulation but also compliance are really meeting young people and users more broadly at the issues they're truly facing. So I think we've definitely come really far in terms of targeted responses and really engaging with stakeholders in like a meaningful way. But there's obviously still further to go because the challenges that we're seeing are emerging almost as quickly, if not quicker, than we are regulating and acting, which is, it's a challenge, but it's something that a lot of good people are working towards making a safer place.
Mm. And it's that rapid change that you've touched on, Cosma, which is really important to focus on. And I guess what's one of the driving forces behind that? Because, in tandem with the changes we're seeing, you mentioned safety. James, you also said about safety increasing. if we look at the drivers, is it all down to the rapid rise of generative AI, or are there other contributing factors out there as well?
I think in terms of AI, I think the issues that we are seeing AI being involved in are issues that have been existing for a long time. They're almost just being supercharged by the development of AI. If we look at things like disinformation, that's been around for a long time, but the volume and sort of extent to which it can convince people is being really propelled by the development of generative AI, such as deepfakes, be that of a sort of gender-based violence and or to in a more political vein. And so I think in terms of driving forces and driving concerns that are really pushing forward advocacy and also policy changes, I think AI is almost like jet fuel to both the problem and the solution. So yeah, it's a really interesting space to be in at the moment, especially as someone that recognizes both the opportunities and sort of the risks of the online world, because I think things like AI can really pose a lot of opportunities for democratizing information and opportunity, but at the same time we have to be able to get past the harm to really make use of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say I would agree with that. The same problems of society were sort of ever thus. If you look at something like ChatGPT, that piece of general purpose technology is the fastest growing piece of general purpose technology in the history of mankind. It was, I think it was rolled out to about 1 million people within 5 days. It was at 100 million within 2 months. And so these are faster than electricity. This is faster than the smartphone. This is faster than the steam engine.
And what about, James, from your perspective in terms of the context for businesses then? Because we've spoken about sort of general society and the impact that that's had, but what challenges specifically is it creating for businesses?
I mean, for businesses, the first thing that springs to mind is sort of fraud. I mean, it depends really what kind of business you're running, but typically things like mis and disinformation will impact businesses, particularly share pricing. Fraud is obviously another one. That is something which is completely industrialized through things like online playbooks and the way that is conducted. So, businesses do have to work extremely hard. There's also the sort of know your customer, know your business, know your vendor, know your clients, know the people that work with you. We have issues with deep faking out of places like North Korea with IT workers, fake workers, which are conducting economic espionage. So again, businesses have a whole raft of additional things which the general public may not have to deal with.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that widespread, it just touches everything we do day to day, doesn't it? And I suppose, Cosima, with the same thread in mind, but in terms of a more personal view, young people and their families having to deal with Gen AI, what's the impact there, and how is that impacting digital well-being and trust online in your perspective?
I think, one of the biggest issues I come across in my work, both sort of on the ground, I work on a digital civics initiative with UCL, and we go around schools across Greater London giving digital literacy education, so talking with young people about how they feel about this. And I think one of the biggest things we're seeing is like a greater erosion in trust, like peer-to-peer, but also between young people and in institutions and things like that, because they simply don't know if what they're looking at is real. And I think that's scary for young people to experience and scary for parents to watch, which I think is something we can attribute a lot of the kind of current salience to, is that it's really concerning to not know what the future holds for your children, but it's also really concerning as a young person to not know what your future job might look like, or what even the political and social information that you're consuming online, if it's really true. And even as someone that works in trust and safety, I guess more broadly, I sometimes struggle to figure that out.
You both alluded to it there, but obviously we should all have an interest in digital safety, whether that's our own personal safety, whether that be the protection of our families, or even when it comes to actually our careers. So James, of course we are a business podcast, and I guess what stake do businesses themselves have in this push for online safety, and what role can businesses actually play in improving things?
I have a sort of vision of the future where businesses will be, particularly digital platform businesses, I hope will be selected on the basis of trust. And I think that there's a whole piece about reputational risk and the fostering of trust is such an interesting conceptual conversation that we keep coming back to. How do you define what trust looks like? Is it ethics? Are your ethics different to my ethics? Is it affinity, which can drive sort of echo chambers? Is it using business KPIs to work out what trust looks like for that specific business? E-commerce is a good example of sort of buying patterns, volumes, which speaks about the trust of either a particular platform or items on that platform. So I think for businesses, there's two aspects. There's the trust of the consumers, and then there's the trust of everything that goes along with it, advertising revenue and all that kind of thing as well. So businesses have a very difficult time sort of navigating not only their own trust, but also the trust of the platforms where they have to increasingly engage young people. Social media being obviously one of them. And when you're associated with a platform that pushes or maybe isn't perceived to have done enough to look at other issues, then I think that's obviously an impact on the reputation of the business as well.
And I think even on the role of businesses as a consumer more so, but also someone that's worked with a lot of digital platforms and businesses more broadly, I think that from a youth perspective, something that young people crave is transparency and authenticity. And I think that those two factors, making sure that that comes across in be it your platform or what you're putting onto platforms as a non-digital business, I think is something that is really needed, because in an age of AI when we don't know what's necessarily real, making sure that we're doing everything we can to push that authenticity and transparency, I think would really help breed that trust that James is talking about.
I think the fact that FlipGen exists in the first place speaks volumes of the fact that there's a requirement and there's a need and there's a want for digital literacy. And there are other platforms which do the same, but even for pre-schoolers. So they're trying to push knowledge about AI and potential online harms way down the age ranges to get people digitally literate a lot earlier. I applaud all of that. I think that's exactly right. But that's really, that's a slow sort of generational thing, which I hope will bear fruit.
No, I really hope so. And I think that in terms of what businesses can do to support those initiatives is really important, because the literacy element that James is talking about is almost what we have to fill the regulatory gaps or sort of combat any sort of delays we're seeing in implementation or strengthening of legislation. And so as much as building the literacy takes time, rolling it out is something that desperately needs to happen quite quickly so that we can empower young people to navigate what we can't catch or aren't currently catching in terms of regulation and moderation.
It's a super important topic, and actually we're going to touch on digital literacy a little bit more as we go on through the conversation. But if we sort of look now at the progress that's been made to date, we spoke about sort of where we've got to in the last 2 years or so, but and some of those key policy changes that go alongside that in an effort to protect us all online. But it would be useful to understand what's driven those changes. And Cosima, maybe I'll ask you this first. What's turned them from a suggestion to reality? Because I know you've been front and centre at some of these conversations. And are there any lessons you think that have been learnt along the way as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a real variety in terms of what has been driving the change. I think one of the biggest things, obviously, is the implementation of regulation, because has always been trust and safety efforts by platforms, but the regulation really sort of gave guidance and sort of focus to maybe those efforts. And I think we have seen some pretty demonstrable change since those regulations have come about, especially in terms of regulation that focuses more on design and delivery of content as opposed to necessarily just taking things down. I think that's something that causes some of the most significant change, because as much as taking harmful content down is incredibly important and sort of dealing with the repercussions of that, what stands to make really significant impact is making sure that that harmful content doesn't get to people and that well-being is sort of built in as a consideration within platforms. And I think we are starting to see that both through UK and EU legislation, and we're even seeing some efforts at a state level in the US and more broadly across European states. So I think that's a really big factor. I also think there's been a lot of sort of external shocks or serious cases. Talking about the problem and the attention that's got has really pushed through change, because it's harder to ignore when it's real life. And also I think that those cases really show people why this matters. Because as like a concept, online safety to young people can seem as a bit boring, and to parents can seem far away from their own lives. But it really does impact everything, because it's your children's well-being, or if you're a young person, it's your life really. We all live digital lives. As like a state, it's our democracy. And so I think that these real life cases really show people why it matters and then bolster on action. And I'd also say that we have seen much more international collaboration on this. There's still a way to go. But as sort of a borderless issue, having that cross-border dialogue is really important.
And as you say there, you know, a lot of this is around cases and stories and the real importance of the human side of that. I suppose in some ways, though, is it sometimes, if we're talking about success of digital safety, is that a hard thing to quantify and sort of evaluate, I suppose? So maybe, James, I'll come to you first.
Yes.
But how do you actually measure the sort of real-world effects of legislative and technological change when it comes to that measurement side of things?
I mean, success is super difficult in this environment. We tend to think of the improvements in safety as systemic. They're not necessarily visible. So it's more about what's going on with the platforms rather than what's happening in the sort of human interactive context. So you mentioned obviously regulation, that's a huge driver. So success in that regard looks like remaining or getting and remaining compliant. But then there are a number of other follow-on issues that come from regulation. We've seen the entire industry of trust and safety professionalize as a result of having regulation. I mean, before we had regulation, we still did trust and safety. We just did it for other reasons, and those reasons were A, because it's the right socially impactful thing to do, and B, obviously it supports business growth as well. So again, there you can see business growth KPIs, numbers of users. I mean, we've said that trust is hard to quantify, but the professionalization of trust and safety has been another impactful piece of fallout from the legislation. So sort of first and second line teams are now working more closely together on things like risk assessments. We mentioned a lot about parents earlier. It's not just a dining room table, it's a boardroom or a board table issue. And obviously things like safety by design is way more embedded. So from a systemic point of view, you can point to those as indicators of success. Also the rise of better detection tools. We talk a lot about generative AI as a harm, but obviously it has a lot to do with the solution as well. Now harms are very flexible, and they do have that kind of speed and the reach that you spoke about. But again, the detection systems themselves are improving at pace as well. Whether they're keeping pace is a whole separate conversation. But again, we see the improvements through technology. So we can see success in terms of compliance, we can see success in terms of business development and professionalization, and we can see success in terms of the tools, techniques and procedures that we have to combat harms as well.
And I think in terms of measuring it, obviously it is difficult. I think, James, you bring up some really good ways in which businesses can measure it, but I think as a research person and a user as well, I think that's something really important to engage with in terms of measurement is talking to young people. Progress, I think, in terms of how it's felt is really important. It's not just like a quantitative issue, it's a qualitative thing. And we can only really get that from conversations. And so I think that a really significant way of measuring progress is engagement with young people themselves, and be that through platforms like youth councils and things like that, or government channels to engage with young people in terms of if their regulation is working. I think establishing those methods is really important to get live feedback on what you're doing.
I'd say the super interesting thing is if trust and safety works well, you don't really hear about the harms. So it's kind of a negative measure of success. We only ever talk about the harms that slip through the net. Imagine all the harms that platforms are catching, either through automation or human intervention in edge cases and things like that. So that is a very difficult measure of success, because you're thinking about the negative presence of something ultimately.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And James, some of these moves like social media bans for under 16s or stricter age verification are controversial. But without getting bogged down in the political and personal debate, are there additional approaches or solutions that can complement these policy changes or address some of those concerns?
Yes. It's important to acknowledge why things like the social media bans are taking place, and the sort of the the political and the technical backdrop that has led to that. But the other alternate things that we can do involve, I mean, we've mentioned digital literacy. I think that is one of the sort of number one issues that we can, or that is the number one issue that we can seek to push long term. I mean, that is a long term solution, quite obviously. But that combined with the tightening up of the existing regulation and the increase in enforcement powers. So we need a sort of a carrot for people who are users. We need a stick in terms of regulation, and the combination of those two things I think is very powerful. That said, I do understand the reasons for talking about the ban, and really Australia has sort of fired the starting gun on a lot of the conversations that we're now having, even here in the UK and further afield in Europe. So that is a sort of a wave of conversation that's happening. But really, I think to solve this issue for the long term, we need to drive better literacy, better skills into the national curriculum here in the UK and in education. But then we also need to we need to look at how regulation is applied when things do go wrong. And then clearly platforms have a lot to have a big stake in ensuring that things don't go wrong.
Definitely. And I suppose, Cosma, then, so much of the importance of this conversation is around sort of young people and children. How do we actually make sure their voices are integrated into the solutions that are sort of coming through? What are young people themselves telling you about what they actually want in terms of a safer online experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how we can get youth engagement in there, I don't think it's difficult to do. I think at the moment, perhaps it's not done to the extent that it should be, or the extent that it could be more so. But in terms of setting up those channels for engagement, it isn't super difficult when there's a massive network of civil society organisations that engage with young people of all different backgrounds. I think it's about tapping into those, but also tapping into young people that aren't involved in initiatives, because their voices matter too. And if we think about making sure that that youth input is representative of the entire UK or on a global scale of the entire world, it's really important that we do tap in to young people of all different lived experiences. I know myself, as someone with experience of like a long-term health condition, a lot of disabled and vulnerable young people really stand to be harmed by online harm, because they are so reliant on the digital world, and so they might have a bit of aversion to coming off of it if it's feeling harmful to them. But I would say that in terms of what young people need to have those safe experiences, it's about making sure that any approach we do take is really holistic, as much as that might be difficult to do. I think that if we want the lasting change that we're talking about long term, it really has to be a dynamic approach. We don't just have sort of necessarily one law to fix every problem we have in the physical UK. So I think it's about coming together lots of different options for the digital equivalent too. But as James said, there are definitely valid concerns behind the conversation of to ban and not to ban. It's a really scary place at times.
James, you know, one of the solutions, and you touched on it earlier, that's often proposed is safety by design. I suppose briefly, can you outline A, what that means, and then B, I suppose, what are the biggest barriers preventing wider adoption of the safety by design principles within tech companies?
I mean, safety by design is a concept of driving safety into all aspects of platform or social media design, obviously by the name, and that includes product launch, that includes policy writing, that includes user onboarding. So if you think about the user journey pre-platform, a young person goes onto a platform, a good safety by design principle would be to show them all of the terms and conditions, have a sort of a safety center, explain to them what the platform is going to look like, how do they do reporting, and then make those actual systems very easy to do once you're actually on the platform. Things like age verification is a good example of a safety by design tool where required. And so having that kind of know your customer, know your user onboarding process, as well as once they're on the platform, actually all the sort of user experiences, what they're shown, what they're algorithmically fed, all of that is part of the sort of safety by design culture. What I would say is one of the barriers towards safety by design is the tension between safety, privacy, and free speech. So there's a sort of a triangle always pulling against each other in that respect. And so some platforms and some jurisdictions will prioritise things like free speech and the privacy of users, and then seek to enforce when content trips over existing laws. Those jurisdictions that have online safety laws or digital services type laws, as per the EU, will seek to predefine what safety looks like. But again, it's quite principles based. So as long as a platform can demonstrate that it understands the risk and has mitigated the harm in a transparent way, that's really what the regulators are looking for. So that is kind of safety by design in a regulated environment.
Looking for a way to make a difference while you shop? Well, with Scope, you can. Scope is one of the national charities Deloitte supports as part of our social impact programme. Visiting any of their retail stores or online shop helps to support Scope's work to create an equal future for disabled people. Every pre-loved item purchased or donated funds vital services and helps keep millions of items out of landfills. It's good for people and it's good for the planet. Just visit scope.org.uk to find out more. So we're going to move on to, I suppose, the work that still needs to be done in this space. And James, maybe we'll start with you to begin with. I suppose, what are some of the biggest challenges and risks in online safety that you think are still largely unaddressed, even with all this progress that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that generally things are safer. I think that systemically things are safer by design. I just think that they're more complex by experience, those of us that experience digital world. I think we've mentioned Gen AI. We can't really have a conversation without talking about the accelerative risk of Gen AI and the fact that its use in harms is more has more speed and reach than its use as a detection tool. I think we need to look at things like reducing the innovation cycle on products when regulation has to go through policy and it has to go through legal, and then it gets to the engineering side, and then it may or may not be either possible or it may or may not actually solve the problem. You need a much faster pipeline in business between regulation and engineering solutions. So that would be one thing. I think public-private or collaboration across the whole ecosystem is absolutely vital. There is a number of industries that show us where collaboration is very effective. So the financial services industry, the insurance industry is another one. There just aren't enough cross-ecosystem knowledge and data sharing functions at the moment, in my view, within the digital platform space, or at least within the social media space. And we could do more in that respect as well. So that would be my points to
holistic
make.
approach,
Yes.
for sure. And Cosmo, what about in terms of what you're seeing? Where are some of the biggest gaps from the work that you're doing and the experience that you've had at FlipGen?
Yeah, I would say that, like James mentioned, I think a really significant gap is collaboration, because this issue touches everyone, as we've talked about. It requires everyone pitching in, and I mean that's young people to some extent, because obviously they have to, in order to reap the benefits, it's important to learn how to be a responsible digital citizen. But I think more of the onus falls on platforms to really make sure that trust and safety infrastructure is really there, for governments to make sure that the regulation they're putting in truly meets the issues that young people and all users are facing, especially as they are emerging at such a fast pace. It's also, I mean, obviously teachers and schools are very much overloaded at times, and so as much as we don't want to create more work for them, it is one of our biggest access points for young people, and so a degree of digital literacy, online safety education has to take place there, because it's where we can get to them. And also I think it's partly, don't like to say on parents, but I think there is a role for parents to play to make sure that that open dialogue is there with their young people, with their children, so that if an issue comes up, they feel comfortable to speak about it. So I think that the gap is the fact that all of those working parts need to come together.
And Cosmo, I suppose, looking at FlipGen and digital literacy, we said we were going to touch on this in more detail. Yeah. We know FlipGen strongly advocates for improved education and digital literacy as a way to mitigate online harm. But What specific elements from your perspective are you hoping to see in terms of digital literacy and empowerment to tackle some of the challenges we've spoken about in the pod?
Yeah, I mean, so at FlipGen, our sort of principle is no tech with a K, not no tech, because we think that it's really important that we recognise the value that the digital space holds for young people, but equally taking seriously the risks that it poses. And so in terms of what that digital literacy needs to look like, for me, from my experience, it has to be adaptive. It has to sort of be context specific. I hosted a lot of like youth engagement focus groups in the summer with young people from across the country from all different backgrounds, and their experiences of the digital world were so varied. And so the digital literacy programs I was putting together for students in North London would not work for those other kids who were from the Black Country or from Scotland or Wales, whatever else it might be. And so as much as it is a big task, to get it right, we have to meet young people where they are to make sure that that education is there. I think it's also really important that we coordinate it, because there's a lot of resources out there, but people don't always know that they're there. In fact, most of the time they don't know that they're there because they don't have necessarily the reach that businesses or government might have, because they're ultimately charities largely. And so I think it's really important that those with more influence work to uplift those initiatives. And I think it's also important, I mean, we've seen the government in their amendment of the curriculum including digital literacy-esque PSHE provisions by 2028. It's really important that the government works to coordinate digital literacy and make sure that it is dynamic, because we've talked a lot about in the past hour how quickly the space is changing and how dynamic it is, and digital literacy created now will not work in 3 months. So it has to be iterative, and it's a big challenge, but with all of those different actors out there, it's possible. It's obviously just about resources and reach, and so I think it's those with the influence and the resources and the reach using that to uplift and properly like resource those efforts, not only for young people but for their parents too. It's a really difficult thing to understand when adult algorithms obviously personalize very much to what they see. What they see is very different from what their children see. And so it must be incredibly difficult to parent in the digital age at times. And so it's really important that whatever resources we're putting out there are also helpful for parents too.
I can take up the parental shout out as an advocate for that. I think it's really important to drive the point that we shouldn't sort of outsource resilience to young people. But of course, part of that is trying to educate the parents as well. It's very difficult to just do life in general as a parent when your children are living in a completely digitally different world to that which you yourself grew up and I grew up sort of pre, I guess in the 80s, kind of pre-home computers and pre-internet and that kind of thing. Completely different environment. So the adults themselves also need that level of support. We want to find a way of sort of educating and bringing in slowly but safely to a point where you get to the age of whatever future technological consent looks like, and children are then ready to enter that world very safely. They don't just hit a cliff edge and have no idea how to live in that space.
So let's bring things back to business. Let's maybe think about the role of business in creating a safer digital world. So James, how can organisations move beyond just compliance to actively drive positive change in online safety?
That's a great question. I think first up, I would talk a lot about collaboration, and that's not just across businesses themselves, but that also involves collaboration with external agencies, civil society, the regulators themselves. We really need a whole of society approach. We need probably better data sharing, I would say, which is another form of collaboration between businesses. I would say having a look at more flexible policies, which are more responsive to a changing harms environment. And you've spoken a lot about safety by design. I also mentioned faster innovation cycles, which again I would sort of pick up on to say that again companies need to respond to harms which are faster.
So as we start to come to a close of the session today, let's maybe end with some takeaway advice for all of us as individuals. So if you could choose one thing that we could all do in an effort to make the internet safer, what would it be?
I think at a personal level, something we can all do is make sure that when we come across information in the digital world, we really take a moment to think about why am I seeing this? What am I feeling about it? What should I do with it? And how can I verify what I'm seeing? Because I think one of the biggest challenges we are seeing in the age of AI and everything else is misinformation. And it has really broad consequences for everyone, no matter who you are. And so one of the things we can really do ourselves is verify what we are seeing as best as we can, and not sending things on until we really know that they're true.
I'd say from a business perspective, minimizing the need for people to have to make such deep critically thought decisions. They should be able to have a level of trust. And so from a business perspective, you're talking about the sort of receipt of the information and the trust that you have. But from the business side, we should definitely be looking to push pre-vetted, legitimized, well-considered and trusted information out. One of the things that I like to talk about is pro-social design, which is the pushing of positive messaging. And from the sort of world of gaming, the kind of rewards for positive social behaviour, which is then seen by your peer group, rather than constantly having a sort of a punitive conversation like we talk about with regulation and sort of the parent-child relationship. Where do we have the conversation about sort of positive messaging? And I think that's a whole other podcast. I would say from a business perspective, pushing trusted information so that we can help users to make the correct decisions in their lives.
Brilliant. Well, it's been a fascinating and eye-opening conversation, and feels like we're only scratching the surface really of a much broader piece. But finally, we always like to bring it back to our big question, and I put it to you first, Cosima. Is the internet getting safer?
I think that the internet itself structurally is getting safer. There's a lot being done to make that happen. But I think equally, sometimes it doesn't feel that way as a young person, as a user more broadly at times, because it can be really scary to be bombarded with everything. More so just overwhelming. So I'd say it is getting safer. It's just not always the case on the user end. But I think that even as a young person that exists in the digital world, it does feel safer than it did a few years ago. And I really hope that continues at pace.
Let's hope so, yeah. James?
I would say yes. In jurisdictions where we have strong regulation, that is absolutely the case. I think systemically, the internet and platforms in general have got safer by design. I think I would also agree with you. I think experientially, it doesn't necessarily feel like that at the human end because of the speed and scale of new types of harms through new technologies. But I would say systemically, yes.
Excellent. Well, Cosima, James, some fantastic conversation, brilliant insights. Thank you very much for joining us in the Green Room.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. And make sure your notifications are on, so that way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad, original music by Ali Barrett.